The year was 1964. Richard Petty had just been black flagged at Daytona, not for cheating, not for dangerous driving, but for showing up with an engine so devastating that NASCAR officials took one look under the hood and essentially said, "Absolutely not." The engine in question? A 426 cubic inch Hemi that would become the most controversial, most banned, and ultimately most respected power plant in American motorsports history. This is the story of how Chrysler built a race engine so dominant that it forced NASCAR to rewrite its entire rulebook, triggered a manufacturer boycott that nearly destroyed stock car racing, and created a legend that still makes grown men weak in the knees 60 years later. Picture the scene at Daytona International Speedway, February 1964. The garage area is buzzing with the usual pre-race tension when Plymouth and Dodge teams start unloading their cars. Competitors gather around expecting to see the familiar wedge-head 426 engines that Chrysler had been running. Instead, they're looking at something that shouldn't exist in a stock car. Massive aluminum heads with hemispherical combustion chambers, dual 4-barrel carburetors sitting atop a cross-ram intake manifold, headers that looked like they belonged on a drag strip, not a NASCAR superspeedway. Ford and General Motors representatives immediately started making phone calls to Detroit. This wasn't evolution. This was revolution. The 426 Hemi wasn't just another racing engine. It was Chrysler's nuclear option in the escalating horsepower wars of the early 1960s. While Ford was perfecting their 427 side oiler and Chevrolet was massaging their mystery motor 427, Chrysler engineers in Highland Park, Michigan, were resurrecting a design principle that dated back to 1951, but executing it with space-age precision. The hemispherical combustion chamber wasn't new technology. What was new was the ruthless efficiency with which Chrysler weaponized it for NASCAR warfare. To understand why this engine caused such chaos, we need to travel back to 1963. NASCAR was supposedly about stock cars, vehicles that regular people could buy from dealerships. The rulebook stated that engines had to be available to the public in regular production cars. At least 500 units had to be built to qualify. This was called homologation, and every manufacturer bent these rules like a pretzel. Ford had their lightweight Galaxies with fiberglass body panels. Chevrolet mysteriously couldn't seem to build their most powerful engines in sufficient quantities for the public. Everyone was cheating, but they were cheating within accepted parameters. Chrysler was about to flip the table entirely. The development of the 426 Hemi began in early 1963 in Chrysler's Highland Park engineering facility. The project, internally designated A864, was led by Willem Weertman, but the real magic happened under the direction of Tom Hoover, who would become known as the father of the Hemi. Hoover wasn't interested in incremental improvements. He wanted to build an engine that would humiliate the competition so thoroughly that they'd have no choice but to go back to the drawing board. The team started with a simple question: what if we ignore every compromise that production engines require? What if we build something purely for racing, with just enough gesture towards street legality to satisfy the rulebook? The answer was the A864, which would become the 426 Race Hemi. The basic architecture was breathtaking in its purposefulness. The block was a deep skirt design cast from premium iron, with cross-bolted main-bearing caps that could handle enormous cylinder pressures. The bore was 4.25 inches, the stroke 3.75 inches, giving exactly 426 cubic inches of displacement, just under NASCAR's 427 cubic inch limit. But here's where it gets interesting. The heads were the real revolution. While Ford and Chevrolet were using wedge-shaped combustion chambers with inline valve arrangements, Chrysler went full hemisphere. The intake and exhaust valves were canted at opposing angles, with the spark plug dead center in the dome. Intake valves measured 2.25 inches, exhausts were 1.94 inches. For comparison, the big block Chevys were running 2.19-inch intakes. That extra valve area, combined with the improved flow characteristics of the hemispherical chamber, meant the Hemi could breathe like nothing else on the track. The valve angle was crucial. The intakes were canted at 26 degrees from vertical, the exhausts at 30 degrees. This created a combustion chamber that was 170 cc in volume, massive by the standards of the day. But that volume was perfectly shaped for flame propagation. The hemispherical design allowed for a compression ratio of 12.5.1 on race gas. Later versions would push 13.5.1. The connecting rods were forged steel, massive I-beam designs that could handle the enormous forces. The crankshaft was forged from 4340 steel, cross-drilled for improved oiling and balance to perfection. The valve train was equally impressive, dual rocker shafts per head, with roller-tipped rocker arms actuating those massive valves. The camshaft was a solid lifter design with duration figures that would make street engines idle like paint shakers. 296 degrees of intake duration, 310 degrees on the exhaust, with 0.520 inches of lift. The overlap period where both valves were open created a scavenging effect that helped clear exhaust gases and pack in fresh charge. But the real party trick was the induction system. Chrysler bolted two Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetors onto a aluminum cross-ram intake manifold. Each carburetor fed the opposite bank of cylinders with runners that were tuned for maximum power between 5,500 and 7,000 RPM. The total airflow capacity was approximately 1 to 800 CFM. The exhaust headers were equal-length tubes, 2.25 inches in diameter, merging into collectors that were engineered for optimal scavenging. Every detail was obsessed over. The oil pan was a deep sump design with trapdoors to prevent oil starvation during high G cornering. The distributor was a dual-point design with mechanical advance curved specifically for racing fuel. The result of all this engineering? On Chrysler's dynamometer in Highland Park, the 426 race Hemi was producing 425 horsepower at 6,000 RPM and 480 pound-feet of torque at 4,600 RPM on relatively conservative tuning. But that was just the beginning. Race teams quickly discovered that with aggressive tuning, higher compression, and wilder camshafts, they could extract well over 500 horsepower. Some drag racing versions were pushing 550, even 575 horsepower. In 1964, those numbers were simply staggering. Chrysler didn't just build one or two prototypes. They constructed approximately 50 race engines for the 1964 season, distributing them to their top NASCAR teams. Petty Enterprises got several for their Plymouth operation. Cotton Owens received engines for his Dodges. Ray Fox, Buck Baker, Bobby Isaac, all the Chrysler-backed teams received these weapons. The cost per engine was astronomical for the era, approximately $3,000 in 1964 dollars, equivalent to about $30,000 today. But Chrysler wasn't selling these to teams. They were providing them as part of their factory backing program. The first public demonstration of the Hemi's superiority came during Daytona Speed Weeks in February 1964. Richard Petty put his Plymouth on the pole with a speed of 174 418 mph, a full 3 mph faster than the fastest Ford. In the twin 100-mile qualifying races, Plymouth and Dodge drivers swept the top 5 positions in both races. Paul Goldsmith won the first qualifier, Petty took the second. Ford and General Motors teams were stunned. Their engineers were taking measurements, photos, making frantic calculations. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Then came the Daytona 500 itself. What happened next was complete domination. Richard Petty led 184 of 200 laps. Plymouth and Dodge drivers finished first, second, and third. The margin of victory was a full lap over the nearest Ford. Jimmy Pardue's Plymouth finished second. Paul Goldsmith's Plymouth third. The fastest Ford, driven by Marvin Panch, was so far behind he might as well have been in a different race. The NASCAR establishment was in crisis mode. Bill France Sr., NASCAR's founder and president, had a problem. The Ford Motor Company and General Motors were threatening to withdraw from NASCAR entirely if something wasn't done about the Hemi. Ford's racing director, Leo Beebe, made it clear that Ford would not continue to participate in a series where they had no chance of competing. GM's Vince Piggins delivered a similar message. France was caught between a rock and a hard place. Allow the Hemi and lose Ford and GM. Ban the Hemi and lose Chrysler. The technical argument against the Hemi was that it wasn't a stock engine available to the public. Chrysler had made no effort to homologate it for street use. You couldn't walk into a Dodge or Plymouth dealer and buy a car with a 426 Hemi. It was a pure racing engine, and that violated the spirit, if not the letter, of NASCAR's rulebook. Of course, Ford's 427 High-Riser and Chevrolet's Mystery Motor were equally unavailable to civilians, but those engines at least maintained the appearance of production intent. After the Daytona 500, France called an emergency meeting. The decision was swift and brutal. The 426 Hemi was banned from NASCAR competition, effective immediately unless Chrysler made it available in regular production cars. Furthermore, France announced new rules that would limit engine displacement to 405 cubic inches for 1965, except for engines available in regular production vehicles. This was a direct attack on Chrysler's racing program. Chrysler's response was equally dramatic. On April 15, 1964, Chrysler Corporation announced they were withdrawing from NASCAR entirely. Every Chrysler-backed team, Petty Enterprises, Cotton Owens, Ray Fox, parked their cars. Richard Petty, the sport's biggest star, was suddenly racing drag cars instead of stock cars. The 1964 NASCAR season, which had started with such promise, turned into a Ford parade. With no competition from Chrysler, Ford won 30 races. Ned Jarrett won the championship in a Ford, but attendance plummeted. Fans weren't interested in watching Ford race against Ford. Behind the scenes, negotiations were fierce. France needed Chrysler back. Television networks were threatening to reduce coverage. Track owners were reporting disastrous ticket sales. The Southern 500 at Darlington, one of NASCAR's crown jewels, saw attendance drop by 35%. Ford's domination was killing the sport. Meanwhile, Chrysler engineers weren't sitting idle. They were working on something that would satisfy France's requirements while maintaining the Hemi's superiority. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Chrysler would build a street version of the 426 Hemi and install it in regular production cars available to anyone with enough money. The street Hemi, designated A102, would share the same basic architecture as the race engine, but with modifications for street use. Cast iron heads instead of aluminum, saving hundreds of dollars per engine. A single 4-barrel carburetor instead of dual quads. A milder camshaft that would actually idle properly. Lower compression ratio that could run on pump gas, though 100 octane was strongly recommended. But here's the kicker. Even detuned for street use, the 426 Street Hemi was rated at 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. These were gross ratings measured without accessories, but still, no other production engine came close. The compression ratio was lowered to 10.25.1. The camshaft was considerably milder with 276 degrees of intake duration and 284 degrees of exhaust duration. The valve lift was reduced to 0.450 inches. A single Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetor with 750 CFM capacity replaced the dual quads. The street Hemi was expensive. In a Plymouth Belvedere, the Hemi option cost $1,105, nearly a third of the car's base price. The engine required premium fuel, synthetic oil was recommended, and valve adjustments were needed every 3,000 miles. The warranty was limited. Insurance companies classified Hemi cars in their highest risk category. But none of that mattered to the people who bought them. This was the closest a civilian could get to owning a NASCAR engine. Chrysler announced that the street Hemi would be available for the 1966 model year, installed in intermediate-sized Dodge Coronets and Plymouth Belvederes and Satellites. They committed to building at least 500 units to satisfy NASCAR's homologation requirements. In reality, they would build 732 street Hemis in 1966, 138 in 1967, and continue production through 1971. But the racing version, that was what brought Chrysler back to NASCAR in 1965. For the 1965 season, with the street Hemi satisfying homologation requirements, NASCAR had no choice but to allow the race Hemi back into competition. But France had learned his lesson. New rules were implemented to level the playing field. Chrysler would be limited to 405 cubic inches of displacement if they ran the Hemi heads, while wedge engines could run up to 427 cubic inches. Weight penalties were also imposed on Hemi cars. The playing field was more level, but the Hemi was still a force. Richard Petty returned to NASCAR with a vengeance. In 1965, he started 49 races and won 17 of them in his Hemi-powered Plymouth. But Ford wasn't standing still. They developed their own overhead cam 427, known as the Cammer, specifically to combat the Hemi. The Cammer was even more exotic than the Hemi, with a single overhead cam operating the valves through a timing chain that was 6 feet long. It produced similar power to the Hemi, but was even less suitable for street use. The Cammer triggered another crisis. Chrysler threatened to withdraw again if Ford was allowed to run an engine that had zero pretense of production intent. France, exhausted by the politics, made another controversial decision. The Cammer was banned from NASCAR but allowed in drag racing. Ford was furious. They withdrew many of their factory teams in protest. The 1965 and 1966 seasons became a chaotic mess of manufacturers coming and going, rules changing mid-season, and bitter politics poisoning the sport. Meanwhile, on the track, the Hemi continued to prove its worth. David Pearson won the 1966 championship in a Hemi-powered Dodge. Richard Petty won 27 races in 1967 with his Hemi Plymouth, including 10 in a row, a record that still stands. The engine's durability was remarkable. While Ford's 427s and Chevrolet's big blocks frequently expired in the heat of battle, Hemis just kept running. The hemispherical combustion chamber design distributed heat more evenly, reducing hot spots that could cause detonation or burned pistons. The technical evolution of the race Hemi continued throughout the 1960s. Compression ratios crept up to 13.5.1 and even 14.1 for some applications. Valve sizes increased marginally, with some teams running 2.30-inch intakes. Camshaft profiles became increasingly aggressive, with some teams running over 320 degrees of duration and 0.600 inches of lift. The aluminum heads, initially reserved for factory teams, became more widely available. Weight-saving measures included titanium valves and connecting rods, though these were hideously expensive. The most significant development came in 1970 with the introduction of the improved thick wall block. The cylinder walls were strengthened, the main bearing webbing was reinforced, and the deck surface was thickened. This block could handle over 600 horsepower reliably, with some drag racing versions pushing 700 horsepower on nitromethane. The oiling system was also improved with larger galleries and better drainback provisions. But let me put that in perspective for you. In 1970, a typical family car made about 150 horsepower. A Corvette with the hottest engine option made 370 horsepower. The Hemi was making nearly double that in race trim. It was like bringing a gun to a knife fight, except the gun was legal because Chrysler had followed the rules to the letter, if not the spirit. The Hemi's influence extended far beyond NASCAR. In NHRA drag racing, Hemi-powered cars dominated superstock and funny car categories. Don Garlits used a Hemi to become the first driver to break 200 km/h in the quarter-mile. Sox and Martin's Hemi Plymouth Barracudas became the most successful superstock combination in history. The engine's design influenced everything from marine racing to land speed records. But here's where it gets really interesting. The street Hemi, that expensive, temperamental, warranty-voiding engine that Chrysler built to satisfy NASCAR's rules, it became the most valuable muscle car engine in history. A numbers-matching 1971 Hemi Cuda convertible, they built 11, recently sold for $4.8 million at auction. The engine that was built to circumvent racing regulations became the holy grail of American muscle cars. The race Hemi's statistics are staggering. Between 1964 and 1971, Hemi-powered cars won 101 NASCAR Grand National races. Richard Petty alone won 78 races with Hemi power. The engine won 7 NASCAR Manufacturers' Championships for Chrysler. In NHRA competition, Hemi-powered cars won countless championships and set virtually every record. The engine's competition record was so dominant that it fundamentally changed how racing series wrote their rulebooks. The engineering legacy of the 426 Hemi extends far beyond its competition success. The hemispherical combustion chamber design influenced engine development worldwide. The cross-ram intake manifold concept was adopted by other manufacturers. The attention to valve train geometry and port flow that Chrysler pioneered became standard practice in racing engine development. Modern NASCAR engines, though they no longer use hemispherical chambers, incorporate many design principles that the 426 Hemi proved on track. The human cost of developing and racing the Hemi shouldn't be overlooked. Several test drivers and engineers were injured during development when early versions failed catastrophically. Racing drivers pushed these engines to their limits, and sometimes beyond. The stress of competition at 7,000 RPM for 500 miles took its toll on both machinery and men. But the rewards for those who mastered the Hemi were substantial. Richard Petty built his entire legend on Hemi power. His 7 NASCAR championships, his 200 race wins, his status as the King, all of it was built on the foundation of that hemispherical combustion chamber. The political battle over the Hemi also changed NASCAR forever. It established precedents for how racing series would handle manufacturer advantages. The concepts of balance of performance, restrictor plates, and technical equivalency all trace their roots back to NASCAR's struggle to contain the Hemi. Bill France's handling of the Hemi crisis established the template for how racing series would manage manufacturer competition for decades to come. Production of the race. Hemi continued through 1971, when NASCAR's rules changed again to effectively obsolete the design. Chrysler built approximately 500 race Hemi engines over 8 years, though exact numbers are disputed because many were rebuilt multiple times. The street Hemi was discontinued after 1971, a victim of rising insurance costs, tightening emissions regulations, and Chrysler's own financial troubles. The company was losing money on every street Hemi they built, selling them below cost just to maintain eligibility for racing. But the story doesn't end in 1971. The 426 Hemi became a legend that grew larger with each passing year. Restoration specialists learned to rebuild them to better-than-factory specifications. Modern technology like electronic fuel injection and improved metallurgy allowed builders to extract even more power. Today, a properly built 426 Hemi can produce over 800 horsepower naturally aspirated, with forced induction versions pushing well beyond 1,000 horsepower. The influence on modern engineering is undeniable. When Chrysler resurrected the Hemi name in 2003 for their new 5.7-liter V8, they were trading on the legacy of the 426. Though the modern Hemi doesn't use true hemispherical chambers, the marketing power of that name, earned through domination on NASCAR tracks in the 1960s, was worth billions in brand value. Every time someone says, "It's got a Hemi," they're invoking the spirit of those race engines that were too good for their own good. Think about that for a second. An engine so dominant that it nearly destroyed the sport it was built to compete in. An engine that forced a billion-dollar industry to completely rewrite its rules. An engine that was banned, then begged to return, then handicapped, and still kept winning. The 426 Hemi didn't just compete in NASCAR. It conquered it so thoroughly that NASCAR had to change what it meant to be a stock car. The technical specifications tell only part of the story. Yes, the Hemi made more power than its competitors. Yes, it was more durable, more efficient, more advanced. But what made the 426 Hemi truly special was that it represented a philosophy. While Ford and General Motors were playing politics and making compromises, Chrysler engineers asked a simple question. What if we just built the best engine possible and figured out the rules later? That philosophy, that audacious confidence, is what made the 426 Hemi more than just an engine. It became a symbol of American engineering at its most ambitious. No compromise, no apologies, no backing down. When NASCAR said it was too powerful, Chrysler didn't detune it. They built a street version that was barely street legal and said, "There, it's production, now let us race." Today, surviving race Hemis are treasured artifacts. A complete documented race Hemi can sell for over $200,000. The knowledge to build and maintain them is passed down like sacred texts among a small community of experts. The sound of a race Hemi at full song, that distinctive roar that combines mechanical violence with precision, is instantly recognizable to anyone who loves American racing. Modern NASCAR, with its spec engines and tight regulations, would never allow something like the 426 Hemi to exist. The sport has become too corporate, too controlled, too concerned with parity. But for a brief moment in the 1960s, one engine ruled supreme through sheer engineering excellence. It wasn't just better than the competition. It was so much better that it broke the sport's entire concept of competition. The legacy lives on in unexpected ways. Every time a racing series implements balance of performance adjustments, they're acknowledging the lesson of the Hemi. Every time a manufacturer builds a homologation special, they're following Chrysler's playbook. Every time an engineer pushes the boundaries of what's legally allowed in competition, they're channeling the spirit of Tom Hoover and his team in Highland Park. The 426 Hemi proved that in racing, as in war, there's no such thing as too much superiority. It proved that engineering excellence, pursued without compromise, could overcome politics, rules, and competition. It proved that sometimes, just sometimes, building something so good that it breaks the game is exactly what the game needs. In the end, the 426 Hemi's greatest achievement wasn't the races it won or the records it set. It was forcing an entire industry to raise its standards. Ford developed the Camry in response to the Hemi. Chevrolet created the ZL1 427. The horsepower wars of the 1960s, which gave us the greatest muscle cars ever built, were sparked by Chrysler's audacious decision to build an engine that was too good for NASCAR to handle. That's the real legacy of the 426 race Hemi. Not just the victories, not just the championships, not just the technical innovations. It's the reminder that sometimes the best response to a rulebook isn't to follow it more carefully. It's to build something so spectacular that the rulebook becomes irrelevant. Chrysler didn't outsmart the rulebook. They obliterated it with excellence. What do you think was the most audacious racing engine ever built? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more stories about the machines that changed motorsports forever.